Well, hello there. It is Kristi. Thank you for coming by my channel and clicking on this video. I'm doing my weekend podcast, YouTube, radio thingamabob that I've been developing here, where I do a casual chat, I present some visual information for you guys to look at, and yeah, we just do a chill bit of time together, hanging out, talking about things. So welcome. Thank you for stopping by. For this week's show, I have set up a few stories that we're going to chat about and yeah, see how this goes. My OBS skills are improving. As you can see, I've got video streaming into the broadcast. That's super awesome. And as we'll see in a little bit, I've actually figured out how to work the browser setting as well, although we're going to practice with that. So I might need a little bit more time. What you're looking at on your screen now is my montage, or sort of, series of pictures that I found from Twitter documenting the Women's March from this last weekend. So in this segment, I am honoring our heroines of the gynocracy, those people who decided that they couldn't just sit at home and do nothing, who felt moved by one or more issues to create a homemade sign, to drive to a bigger city, or maybe even go by bus or caravan with a bunch of other people in order to be physically present, to say, I am a no vote against this policy. When I went on the Women's March last January, I didn't know what to expect, and I was completely blown away by the sheer volume of people around me. And Washington, D.C. wasn't even the biggest one. I think that there were bigger ones even in other parts of the New York City or Los Angeles had, on par, if not bigger, marches. And we saw that kind of massive turnout again this year. And it really warms my heart to know that there are other people who are committed enough to take that time to be physically present, to connect with others, to stand and with hundreds of thousands, millions of other people around the country saying, we're going in the wrong direction. This is not the America of our Constitution when we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We fought for these ideals. We shouldn't settle for less. That's a little Hamilton call out for any of you in the know. And these images that you're seeing on screen really inspire me. I love homemade signs. They're my favorite kind of thing to see on a political protest march. When I was in DC, that was what I found myself constantly searching the crowds for when we got to move, because we were stuck. Steve Shives and I were march buddies. I'm sure there's a picture of that in my images that'll come up. But we were stuck for like 4 hours in just this mass of people. And once we were able to march and actually kind of go out into DC and walk around and connect with others and see their signs, the homemade signs for me were always truer than the ones where you just pick up a sign because, like the socialists have made a whole bunch of them saying that they want to oppose this, that, or the other thing. The homemade signs are the ones that I love. And this, again, I was trying to capture that feeling of the homemade sign. So all of the images you're seeing, I should say, by the way, come from Twitter. They come from what people tweeted on the day of the march, or on, basically it was all on the Saturday. I didn't take any images from the Sunday. And I will have to, I'm just going to have to put up my hands and say, the first few tweets that were in this sort of collection that you're watching scroll by, the first tweets that you saw in my montage that I put together had the name of the person who tweeted it, usually because they were talking about like a city or something in the text, and I wanted to capture the location. But I realized if I wanted to capture the marches in 2018, I wouldn't be able to do that just by doing tweets. So I captured the images that people uploaded, but that means I haven't been able to get anybody credit. So if there's an image you like, what I would recommend is go to the hashtag Women's March or Women's March 2018, and that's where I got all of these images. And if anyone sees this and say, hey, that's my image, I will totally give you credit. But for me, it was more about, again, trying to capture this spirit of the whole homemade signs and what issues people are working on. A lot of the signs stayed the same. You know, this is what democracy looks like, or discussing things about, you know, Trump's hair or whatever else. But Me Too really became something new in the Women's March this year. People acknowledging sexual harassment and sexual assault, that it's not just unacceptable, but it's also unacceptable to have systems of power in place that allow men, and it's almost exclusively men that I've seen, who have used their positions of power in order to silence people, and especially women, but also men, of course, into silence. They're silencing people in order to get away with their sexual predations and to be able to continue doing them. It's the system that people are also objecting to, not only the sexual harassment and the sexual sort of predation of these men, hashtag not all men, but also the power structures around them. And that's, for me, really inspiring. I'm going to let this continue to run as I set up the next sections that I'm going to talk about, because there are so many images. As I said, I have over 200 that I was able to put together, and then I dropped them into a software on my phone, actually, my CyberDirector. I'll do a little shout out for CyberDirector app on my phone. I think it was about €7 that I paid for it. And yeah, I just dropped the pictures, like I would save them to my phone and then drop them into the CyberLink PowerDirector app, and I just like put them together, and in the end there were over 200, which was crazy. And that's just probably a smattering of all of the pictures that were taken and uploaded about the march. So have a look at those images before we move over to our next section. What I have for the rest of the show is I want to look first at a common mistake that I see being made. I'm gonna name drop. I'll name drop Sargon and Vee here because they're two big YouTubers who spread this lie a lot, but they're not the only ones. There are many people who have a mistaken impression about the history of the word liberal, and they make the allegation that progressives somehow took the word liberal and tried to make it like their word. This is entirely wrong. I mean, this is so beyond wrong that it really confirms my impression of how idiotic and lazy intellectually both of these individuals are. You know, Vee, I know, is a doctor, and he might actually do work when it comes to his field and knowing it well, but when it comes to actually doing research on other stuff, he just seems to talk out of his butt. And we know that Carl is a pretty dim bulb. He's lazy. He's not intellectually deep. He also doesn't have the self-awareness that when he is starting to learn about something, to not talk about it until he understands it entirely. You know, he'll read something from Locke, and then he'll just immediately start using it and citing Locke as if he understands Locke. So we're going to go through an article that demonstrates empirically that it wasn't progressives who made the word liberal, a word that's associated with the political left and progressive, what we would now call progressivism. It was Republicans. In particular, it was Ronald Reagan. So screw you, stupid guys, you're idiots, and I can prove it. The other thing we're going to look at is a little exchange I had with TheGuardian. We had, and I'm not going to like rip on TheGuardian. I have critiques, and I think he's wrong, and I want to explain why that is, but I just want to say that the exchange we had was a little bit spiky, but not mean, shall we say. When you're disagreeing with someone and challenging them, I understand where they would get a little bit defensive. But we actually had an interesting sort of back and forth and a discussion. We came to an impasse. I think I'm right. I think he's wrong. But of course I would, because that's how these things go. I want to review it, though, because there are some important concepts related to the word liberal that come out of it. Then the last thing that, the penultimate thing that I want to do is a story about Russian agents and more evidence that the Russians were actively interfering and having an impact on voters in the last election. This is something, obviously, that I've been going on and on about. People have accused me of being a conspiracy theorist when it comes to the Russian involvement in the election. The more that I look at the analysis and the coverage and the more evidence comes out, I've already come to the conclusion that the 2016 election result was invalid. Trump is not validly our president. He will have the role of president, and obviously he will act in that capacity. But I am now entirely convinced that the election was a fraud, that he was not validly elected, and, our democracy was attacked and destroyed basically in 2016 by Russian interference in combination with GOP gerrymandering and voter suppression. And I want to review that evidence for you guys, because this is a story I will continue to follow, because it's something I care about. Preserving the integrity of elections is an issue I care about deeply. And then finally, just to prove that hashtag, why we need feminism, I want to look at a story coming out of Montana about a prosecutor who wants to jail women who either use alcohol or drugs while they're pregnant. Because apparently state-enforced, isolation of women and when they're incubators, rather than helping them like they were human beings, is how patriarchy operates. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed looking at these images. I will try to bring them back again when it comes to the end bit here. I will do the thing where, I'll bring back the images as I'm doing my closing if I remember. But we are now going to move over into a different area, and I'm hoping that this is going to work out. Now I have to set this up a little bit, because you're going to see my screen. Oh, during live shows, this is so much fun. I really am enjoying learning about OBS. It is pretty complicated though, so I'm sure I'll get better at it over time. All right, so let's switch over here. The history of the word liberal and where it got its connotations with the political left. And I'm going to tell you right now, it didn't come from the left. And this guy over here can prove it. Kenneth Janda. Now, Kenneth Janda, just so that we know his credentials, and if whether or not he's a credible source, you can see that he's a professor emeritus of political science. At least we know that he has experience in his field, and I'm not asking you to go on his word, because we don't have to. He actually does data analysis to demonstrate his point. I went in search of this research. Yeah, I went in search of this research. It rhymes. When I was watching somebody do an analysis of Vee and Sargon talking about the liberalist movement, and they both at different points said, oh, liberals took the word, they stole it, progressives stole the word liberal and they tried to taint it and they tried to make it associated with the left. You guys are idiots. I'm sorry, it's just not the case. And if you would have looked it up beforehand, you would have known that this was not true. So why do you lie, Sargon, Vee? Why do you spread misinformation and untruths to your audience who are gullible, incredible, and credulous and immediately just assume that what you're saying is right when it's wrong? I don't understand this thing at all. Anyway, I'm going to demonstrate to you using this article that the word liberal was not taken by the left from the right and tainted with the notion of progressivism. In fact, it was the Republicans in the United States in the 1980s, especially with the rise of Reagan and his discourse, that the word liberal was turned into a dirty word for the first time in American politics. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing because you can do that. I'll provide links to it in the description box below. But we can see here that the headlines, or the sub-headlines, shall we say, talk about the time period from 1860 to 1960 when Republicans thought liberal was lovely. And here they're talking about, the way you can make things liberal, free from restraint and action. And there was this, like liberal economic policies and liberal pay and liberalized restrictions on naturalization of immigrants, yada, 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 all this kind of stuff meant to make freer, right? Now, from 1964, the author writes, liberal was changed into the word almost like liberalize. And he looks at this term and how it was used, and then we move on to the section that is relevant to us. 1984 to 2012. When liberals became targets. So I will read this a little bit in order to show you what I mean. Things changed in 1984. For the first time in more than a century and a quarter, the Republican platform used liberal negatively. Although praising President Reagan for restoring the American people's faith in the principles of liberal democracy, the platform decried liberal experimenters for destroying the sense of community and destructive patterns of conduct too long tolerated by permissive liberals. During Reagan's presidency, the party dramatically escalated its platform rhetoric. Now their ideological opponents were not just Democrats, members of the opposing party, but dirty liberals, ideological enemies. The 1984 platform made 9 negative references to these liberal Democratic foes. And he then lists them. Perhaps the expanded and escalated rhetoric offensive in the 1988 Republican platform contributed to George H.W. Bush's election. In any event, the party's 1992 platform ratcheted up the invective, advancing 17 negative statements, using the word liberal, and then he lists them. The Republican Party's verbal assault continued in its 1996 platform, which cast 11 aspersions, again using the word liberal. So, to close this section, the 3 Republican platforms of 1988, 1992, and 1996 marked high points for tarring the opposition party with the liberal label. After 1996, the party eased off its rhetoric. In 2000, the platform referred twice to the old liberal agenda and to the old left liberal order. And then they go on to say how it sort of like has died off. And you think about when Fox News started to rise in this discourse, it was very much still the case that liberal had a negative connotation, and that negative connotation was associated with the left in American politics. This is the source of the association between the word liberal and progressive. It's not the left, you idiots. It's the right who took that word and made it a dirty word and then stuck it on their enemies. And then you can see here in the from 1960s to 2012, the Democrats backed off the liberal label. So they stopped using it because it was tainted by the right, and so people stopped using liberal and kind of used progressive. However, that link between the word liberal and the political left was still in the American discourse, and this is what you guys are picking up on. If you go through and you read the rest of this article, it never says that progressives have tried to claim the word liberal. They just made it up, Sargon and Vee, or they're repeating bullshit they heard from somewhere else. I don't know which it is. I kind of really don't care, but I wanted you guys to know that it's wrong, and if you see someone using that accusation, that people on the left stole the word liberal, tell them, ask them for a citation. And when they can't provide one, you can come here and provide this one and tell them to read it and stop spreading misinformation. It's not that hard to read, is it? All right, anyway, I wanted to put that information out there because I think it's super important to use, to present facts, correct facts, and not lie to people, not spread misinformation and propaganda. I know it's such a high bar to put up there, to ask people to put out accurate information in the world. But if we can all just have a few basic minimum standards, I think life would be a bit better. All right, so let's move on to the next thing that I wanted to have a chat with you about, and that was to tell you about a little exchange I had with The Guardian. You might not know who The Guardian is. That's fine. He is a person who was associated with the Kraut Gate thing. He's basically he wasn't with Kraut. I don't really know what side he's on. He seems to be, I guess, if anything else, chaotic neutral, maybe. The Guardian, at least I came across The Guardian for the first time when I started to learn about Krautgate and everything and all the actors involved in Krautgate. The Guardian was one of the people who was in the server but wasn't really on board with it. He ended up giving information over to King of Pole, who put it up on Kiwi Farms, but also, I think, leaked it to, or was involved with the dissemination to the people on the alt-right who ended up doing all of the doc release on that. So he and I, well, here's the story behind it. I was watching a stream. Theron Meyer was on Destiny's stream a couple days ago, and there were two other guests. I kind of just sort of skipped ahead to in the conversation. And there was a guy with what I thought was a Scottish accent, but I missed the name. Like when the person came on, I missed the introduction. But while they were talking about violence in the far left and violence on the far right. And The Guardian threw in a couple, two $5 donations in order to sort of say that the far left is way more violent than the far right. And this, and not just in America, but globally. And this didn't make any sense to me. This comment made no empirical sense because while I don't do international relations, I work in political science departments where I have colleagues and when I was a PhD student, other PhD students who were doing international relations and international conflict studies. From my perspective, it just doesn't make any sense at all to say that there are more left-wing incidents of violence than there are right-wing, because I consider all fundamentalist religious violence right-wing violence based on my understanding of the political spectrum. And the tweet you're seeing here is part of our exchange, and it comes up on how I always sort of anchor the political spectrum in my head. So if you're looking at it, I'll scroll down here a little bit. Right. So this bit, the image that you're seeing on the screen right now is the thing that I was taught in high school. This is how I learned political science from the age of 17 onwards. And in high school, I took the elective courses of psychology and political science my senior year, because even back then I was a nerd for politics. And I very much remember being tested on these terms, even though I wrote the wrong one when I was trying to remember all of them in the tweet. But my understanding of the political left and right, if you don't tell me something else, then I'm going to be thinking about this. And moving from left to right, the categories, as you can see, are radical, then liberal, then moderate, then conservative, and then on the far right, reactionary. What is a radical? What is a reactionary? For me, the concept of a radicalism, is someone who is committed to the transformation of society in a very profound and structural way. Radical feminism, for instance, is about undoing, turning over gender norms, gender roles, sort of removing the whole assumptions about associating your sex and your gender identity so that people can be fully free. That's why it's radical feminist. It's not because they're like have really intense views. That's not what that's not what a political scientist thinks, and it's not what I'm thinking about when you use the term radical on a left-right spectrum. Radical here again means transforming society into something new, something it hasn't been before. And then a liberal is like somebody who has similar views, but they don't necessarily want to go through this massive transformation. They might want to just tinker around the edges. That's me. That's social democracy. That's, let's take democracy because that seems to be working pretty well, but let's make these big changes in the structure of the way power is distributed so that we can have a more equitable society where people can be more free because they have more opportunities for success. economic success, personal success, whatever else. But not a whole, hey, let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. And maybe that's mischaracterizing radicals, but from a liberal perspective, that's the problem with radicals, is they just go too far. Then moderates in the middle, people who are, centrists, I guess would be another way we could call them now. And then right-leaning conservatives. But I guess we should look at the other extreme, reactionaries. What defines a reactionary? A reactionary reacts against change. And in fact, they not only react against change, they want to take society back to an earlier time that they think was better. This is why I count fundamentalist violence as being far-right violence. People who want to go back to the golden age of Muhammad, or they create a caliphate like there used to be back in the day. Christian radicals who want to, who use violence in order to stop abortion rights because they want to go back to a time where women couldn't access legal and safe abortions. That's reactionary. And so anyone who is not only wanting to, let's say, conserve parts of the society that have been useful in the past, but actually rip society out of its current status and put it back into the past. They're the opposite of the radicals. They want to transform society, but they want society to look like it used to, whereas radicals want society to look like something new. And so conservatives, again, are less far-right people. They have sympathies for the past, and they think there are a lot of things in the past that were useful and should be preserved, but they aren't going so far as to say we should roll back women's suffrage. Reactionaries, some reactionaries would. When I, therefore, take this information, and I went to so The Guardian and I had this back and forth about, I challenged him about his assertions, and I gave some data that showed that, there's an increase in violence by white supremacists. Neo-Nazis kill. Neo-Nazis are violent. Neo-Nazis can present themselves very politely with very cool haircuts and wearing button-down shirts. But at the end of the day, the ideology itself is about dehumanizing other people. And when you dehumanize others and you stop respecting them, you make yourself more open to committing violence because you have no regard for their dignity. That mindset, of course, in my mind, that mindset leads to violence. And we saw an uptick in violence by white supremacists in the United States in 2017 compared to the year before. That's just empirically true. Them's the facts. But Guardian's point was that it wasn't limited to the United States in terms of this far left, far right violence comparison. He was talking about global levels of violence. So I asked him for his source. And after he sort of hemmed and hawed, he gave me a tweet. He's like, go look it up. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. He gave me a tweet to a wiki link listing terrorist violence in January, just January of 2018. And when I went down the list, what I saw, and I don't really know if I can get into all of this here, but yeah, I'll show you this one. Right. So from his source, which was a wiki source, he had there were 102 global acts of terrorism that had been counted in January at that point. And as you can see here, a lot of the perpetrators, I'm going to tell you, it looked, just from eyeballing it, almost half of the perpetrators had to do with like Al-Qaeda or some sort of fundamentalist Islamic ideology. Several other of the incidents were down to like a civil war. So it wasn't, an ideologically driven act of terrorism. It's like people in a civil war were blowing each other up. So I think those are ideologically neutral if what they're fighting over is a government. But to me, Al-Qaeda is reactionary. They want to take their areas of the world and go back in time. They want to retreat from secularism. They want to retreat from Western influences and go back to this more pure time. To me, that's clearly far-right ideology, and the violence, therefore, associated in their attempts to create this ideal society is far-right violence. And he was of the opinion that you just don't you just exclude all Muslim extremist violence from the count, which to me seemed ridiculous, because if you did that, when you do that, what you end up with is you get, out of the 102 observations, you end up excluding around like 90 of them. And of the 90 that are then excluded, the 10 or 12 that are left are committed by people who have either like Maoist in their names or People's or Democratic, like the Democratic People's yada yada yada. Which one could just on their face say, okay, these are probably like left. So the Maoists are considered left because they're communist, but Al-Qaeda, who wants to take society back to like, the 9th century, isn't considered far right. So The Guardian and I basically had a fundamental disagreement as to how to define left and right. His definition was not something that he could point to a source. He just made it up. He said anyone who's working on progressive, like pushing human rights is left, and anyone who's working on like something else was right. And it just like, for me, it was completely arbitrary and completely unconvincing. And methodologically, I think the flaw in the way that he was making his claim, and his claim again was there is more far left violence globally in the world than there is far right violence, is simply invalid on his face, because his definitions were arbitrary. He was using ideas like progressive that are very much linked to Western values and Western discourse. And then he was saying, oh, but we can't count this violence over here because it doesn't qualify as far right. Anyway, we went back and forth, and I thought it was, in the end, I said, we have an impasse. Like, we aren't going to agree here, because he wasn't moving off of his point. He also couldn't really define his terms very well. I was citing political science, but he's like, he wasn't convinced by that either. So we had a bit of an impasse, but I thought it was an interesting exchange in terms of understanding how I think about these words as a political scientist versus how they're used on social media. I think if we could all ask each other a bit more, well, where is your definition? What is your definition? Can I look at your sources? And this kind of stuff, for me at least, I'm convinced when The Guardian says there's more left-wing violence globally than right-wing violence, I just think that he's wrong. And I can prove he's wrong with a combination of my definitions and then looking at the observable evidence, and also the simple fact that if we used The Guardian's definitions of left and right, out of 100+ observations, we have to dump 90% of the data. So that to me just is another reason to say, this seems super dodgy. And I'm not convinced, and no one else should be convinced. Up your game, Guardian. But we had a nice chat, and maybe we'll have some more verbal sparring over political science terms in the future. Now, I want to move on to my next story, and this relates again to Russian interference. I'm not going to talk too long about this, but I do want to throw this information out there for those of you who scoff at the idea that the US election is not, basically was not influenced to the point where it tipped it in the favor of Donald Trump. I'm just going to read out the most important bits of it here to make my point. Facebook, Inc. said Russian agents created 129 events on the social media network during the 2016 U.S. election campaign, according to testimony to Congress, shedding more light on Russia's purported disinformation drive aimed at voters. Facebook, in a written statement to U.S. lawmakers released on Thursday and dated January 8th, said that 338,300 different Facebook accounts viewed the events, and that 62,500 marked that they would attend. The company said it did not have the data about which of these events took place. Now scrolling down, one other thing here that, I wanted to pull out. Facebook has previously said that some 126 million Americans may have seen the Russian-backed political content on Facebook over a 2-year period, and that 16 million may have been exposed to Russian information on Instagram. This is a serious problem, people, and I know I bang on about it, and I'm going to keep banging on about it because I care about this big time. It's important to me that we have election integrity. And as the story evolves more, as more information comes out, I will be sure to include it and update you on this. And now we're going to get on to the very last bit of the program that I've prepared for you guys today. We're going to look at the war on women. And I saw this morning. It made me so angry. Yeah. Montana prosecutor who wants to jail moms-to-be who drink or do drugs. The county attorney, Gerald J. Harris, at his office will seek civil restraining orders against pregnant women who, when there are provable violations of such orders, basically that they drink alcohol or use drugs. He has encouraged the public to report instances of mothers-to-be drinking or using drugs to the sheriff. Harris's policy is part of a larger movement to prosecute and incarcerate pregnant women grappling with drug addiction. Roughly half of all U.S. states now consider substance abuse during pregnancy to be child abuse. All right, so let's talk a little bit about whether or not we want women to have addiction issues while they're pregnant. Clearly not. It's not in the baby's interest, it's not in the mother's interest, it's not in society's interest to have women who are, addicted to drugs and having children that are addicted to drugs. I completely understand that we need policy solutions for this problem. My objection is to the use of the criminal prosecution system and jailing women as that solution. That's not a solution. That's like on a Freudian level, like an id reaction. You've got your id, your ego, and your superego. And your id is the part of you when someone annoys you that wants to punch them. That's just the impulse. The superego is the part that's going, no. If you punch that person, you're going to go to jail. It's not worth it. This seems to me like an id reaction. The reaction is to blame the women who are taking drugs or even just drinking alcohol as bad people. And because they're bad people, we can just take them and put them in a cell, punish them, because they can't be trusted. The policy problem is we're worried about these women, but the solution is not to throw them in jail. It's not. We can't just replace the criminal justice system for rehab or treatment. And the other thing too, this idea of sort of like using the community to police women and call in the sheriff's office if you see a woman drinking alcohol. Anyone else find that pretty disturbing? And this attitude that the state can just go into a woman's life and lock her up because she can't be trusted to make her own decisions and they have to basically be in loco parentis and put her on. It just seems to me really, well, it's top-down authoritarian patriarchal power structures that are looking to use power over women in order to force women to behave the way they want, instead of looking at the problem and trying to find a solution to the problem. And if there is an addiction problem, let's find a solution to that problem, not only for the temporary moments of the pregnancy that the sheriff's department seems to care about, but for going forward, for her raising that kid and being with that kid. Throwing her in jail won't solve it. So anyway, hashtag war on women. Doctors think it's a bad policy. Any reasonable person who thinks about it for a while can see why it would be a bad policy. And more importantly, here we've got on the screen, zero scientific evidence this will work. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Academy of Pediatricians, and other major medical groups were quick to condemn the proposed crackdown as ineffectual and harmful. And agreed. Just absolutely agreed. Please be aware of this kind of crap going on. If you live in Montana, maybe, to think about contacting your representatives about protecting women from this kind of crap. Those are the stories I have for you guys today. I can now do my special thing here with my OBS and show you a new screen. How cool is that? Isn't that cool? All right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up here. It's been a lovely time chatting with you. I want you to know also that I am trying to incorporate more into this show. I decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to perfect OBS first. And when I feel comfortable with OBS and all the things I can do in OBS, then I will think about doing live shows. So I know I'm going to have to change the name of it. I think it's just going to be the Kristi Winters Show because it's not live, except when I'm recording it. Obviously, it's live to me, but that doesn't really help anyone else because you can't interact with me. So I'm going to be looking at expanding and extending this. The last video I did, I was happy with, but one big problem that I had was this flickering image problem, you know, you guys might remember from the very first show. And in the video, I had to go through and actually take out one frame from every transition in order to take out that flicker. And I solved the problem technically by moving from an automatic resizing of all the images to keeping all of the images 1-to-1 so they don't have to resize. That seems to have fixed the problem. So I got one technical problem fixed, but I'm sure that when I work with this today, I might find other technical problems on my second one. Anyway, that being said, one thing that I want to add to the show is I'm going to be doing an interview with Natalie Alford. You guys might remember her YouTube channel. She has moved on to other things. She's focusing on her music, but she's been making some really excellent points about the Me Too movement and her experiences with sexual harassment in the workplace. I'm going to get her on for an interview, and then I'm going to add it as a segment, as a sort of a feminist talk back segment to this show. So as you can see, I really am trying to do that thing of incorporating segments from previous iterations of my channel, This Week in Stupid Misogynists, Heroines of the Gynocracy, and Feminist Talk Back. So this is why I'm quite excited about this show. It's why I'm quite keen to continue to develop my skills with OBS and to bring in more things that I care about, but I just don't seem to have the time for. This show seems to be a great place and space to bring those up and present them to you guys. So yes, we're going to wrap this up now, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I have a lot of stuff coming up for the channel in the next week, actually. I have booked a hangout with an upcoming director whose work is just creeps me out. It's really, really scary. I find it very disturbing. His name is James Mansell, and Steve Shives and I are going to have a chat with him that's scheduled for next week. I'm not sure if it's going to be on Steve's channel or mine, but I will keep you up to date on that. Of course, I'll mirror it here if it's on Steve's channel. The other thing that I've got, I said, was the discussion with Natalie coming up next week. And I'm going to be having another chat with Crazy Hair. I've got all kinds of stuff coming up and more on the way. I might even have a very special interview coming up in February with a big YouTuber that, well, far bigger than me. But I want to have, I'll just drop the gendered pronoun him on for an interview and a chat. You can wildly speculate as to who that might be. And I'll leave, I guess, there. So I'll leave it on a tease. But I hope you guys enjoyed the show. And thank you again for stopping by. As always, I appreciate your time and you paying attention to this. All that's left to be said is that I have been Kristi. You have been awesome. And you and I will see each other again really soon. Bye-bye.